my current inclination is to say the multiverse exists because there are so many contexts in physics in which the multiverse arises. I mean, what makes it sound as though there's just one model of the multiverse. There are lots of different contexts in which the multiverse arises. In terms of cosmological theory, you have what's called the inflationary model of the early universe, which produces lots of little bubbles. And you have cyclic models where the universe expands and recollapses and bounces and expands and recollapses. You have models from particle physics. You've got what's called the vacuum landscape, where you've got all these different models predicted by M theory with different values of what's called the cosmological constant. You've got the multiverse of the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. And you've also just got the idea that there may be different universes which are completely disconnected with even different mathematics. So there are many, many different types of multiverse. So when you start saying, do you believe in the multiverse? You have to say, well, which version of the multiverse are you talking about? I take the view that there are so many different versions of the multiverse that one of them is likely to be correct. I just think it's very arrogant to assume that our universe is the only one.
Welcome to Connecting with Coincidence. I am your host, Bernard, or Bernard, as you will see, Beitman. I'm a psychiatrist. I study meaningful coincidences. I have a new book coming out in the spring called Life-Changing Synchronicities. I wanted it to be called The Adventures of Dr. Coincidence because I liked calling myself Dr. Coincidence, but the publisher didn't like it. I had an AI image of what Dr. Coincidence might look like and wanted it on the cover. It was going to be a kind of a cartoon character. They wanted to be serious, so they wanted to make it life-changing synchronicities, a doctor's serendipities and coincidences. So the story I'm telling now, a friend of mine here in Charlottesville was in India, just traveling around and picking up a lot of good energy, seeing a lot of synchronicities. And she was in Goa, sitting at a coffee shop, and some guy walks by that has a shirt on that says Mr. Synchronicity on it. And she stops him and says, I know somebody who calls himself Dr. Coincidence. And this guy says, oh, you mean Dr. Beitman? I enjoyed that one, as you might guess. And I will enjoy our guest today, because we're going to have a rollicking good time talking about all kinds of things, from cosmology to precognition. Our guest today is Bernard Carr, and we are two Bernards in a pod. He's from England, so I like to get called Bernard when I'm in England. He's an emeritus professor of mathematics and astronomy at Queen Mary University of London. For his PhD, he studied the first second of the universe with Stephen Hawking at Cambridge University and also at Caltech. He then held a research fellowship in several places, Trinity College and the Institute of Astronomy at Cambridge, before moving to Queen Mary. His professional area of research is cosmology. That's the whole big thing, ladies and gentlemen, and includes such topics as the early universe, black holes, dark matter, and the anthropic principle. And Bernard, maybe we'll get to that one too, because that's a remarkable coincidence thing that we need to be able to address. I'd like to hear how you think about it. He's also very interested in the role of consciousness, regarding this as a fundamental rather than incidental feature of the universe. He's president of the Scientific and Medical Network. That's where we met, and a former president of the Society for Psychical Research. Bernard, welcome to Connecting with Coincidence.
Thank you, Bernard. It's a pleasure to be here and
it's
to meet someone of the same name.
Yeah, and I was just about to echo the same thing. Bernard, we're two Bernards. Now there's let's start with a major coincidence. We didn't talk about this to begin with. I want to hear one about your precognitive ones, but what is the anthropic principle, the bigger one and the smaller one, and how are they coincidences or synchronicities?
Well, those are two very different questions. The anthropic principle, which is about cosmology and my own personal synchronicities. Um, Maybe I'll start off with the personal ones, Bernard, and then get into the anthropic coincidences. Um, si since you mentioned Stephen Hawking, who was my PhD supervisor and friend, maybe I could start off by describing a nice coincidence involving Stephen.
Wonderful.
Stephen's great hero, he had two heroes. One was Galileo, and one was Albert Einstein. He was born 300 years to the day after the death of Galileo. So he always felt that he had a strong connection with Galileo. In some ways, he had a very similar character. So Galileo was his hero. Sadly, he died about 5 years ago, and he died on the birthday of Albert Einstein. So here are the two heroes linked to his birth and his death. And the other interesting thing about Stephen is his first discovery was what's called the singularity theorem, which says that as you follow your path in space-time, you may have points at the beginning and the end where the physics misbehaves and you don't know what happens. It's called a singularity. So this wonderful coincidence about his birth and death date also related to his first major discovery about funny things happening at the beginning and end points of space-time trajectories. So I don't know how you interpret that. It doesn't have any psychic implication. I suppose it's just a synchronicity. Let me now give you an example from my own experience. I should say that I've been fascinated with synchronicities and coincidences for decades, many decades. And in fact, I have a diary of synchronicities, which I've kept for about 30 years. So I was trying to think which one. I've literally have probably 100 examples, but I decided to choose this one. When I was a fellow at Trinity College doing my PhD with Stephen Hawking, I had a dream. I've always had rather vivid dreams, and I remember them quite well. And in this dream, I dreamt that I was appointed prime minister. Highly unlikely because I have no political ambitions at all. But then at a high table dinner that evening, somebody asked me, who is the new prime minister? And I said, nobody I can see from here. Well, this was a joke because, of course, I couldn't see the prime minister because I was the prime minister. And I found this so funny that I started laughing in the dream and I woke up. The laughing actually woke me up, which is something which has never happened before. I've never laughed myself awake before. So I remembered this dream very vividly and thought, what a stupid dream. I should remember, that I should become prime minister. And in fact, later on that morning, somebody visited me and I told them about this dream. But then at 12 o'clock, round about noon that day, it was announced that the prime minister, who was Harold Wilson, was in fact resigning. He had resigned. And so now, whether you interpret that as a precognition, because I did apparently foresee the resignation of Harold Wilson, which nobody else had foreseen. It wasn't in subject of gossip in the press or anything like that, or whether that was just a synchronicity, who can tell? But I remember that I wanted to mention that synchronicity because first of all, it was associated with a dream, it's associated with precognition, but also it's got this element of humor, because that's what I've always found intriguing about synchronicities. They involve, especially the ones in dreams, they always involve something very unusual. Now, those are some personal examples. Well, the first one is a coincidence, which you may classify as a synchronicity, the Hawking story. The second one is my own experience, which you may describe as a synchronicity or a precognition, but that's maybe two good stories to start with.
They
Now,
are good. They are good stories. And the Stephen Hawking one, where in between he does the misbehaving of physics between Galileo and Einstein, seems to draw almost a portrait of Stephen Hawking's.
it does, but the strange thing is, of course, Stephen would be very skeptical about anything remotely psychic or mystical. You know, he was a down-to-earth physicist who thought everything could be reduced to physics. So, however, and therefore, I don't think he would be very impressed with synchronicities, although I'm sure there were many other synchronicities in his life. But what's interesting about Stephen is he had a wonderful sense of humor. And he also, in some sense, I always felt had a sort of control over life and death. In some sense, his whole life had been a battle against death. You know, he was supposed to die in 3 years and he lived for another 50 years or something. So it's as though his willpower, he had this will to live and die. And I've often thought, well, maybe Stephen, part of him with his wonderful sense of humor, decided to die on Einstein's birthday. Because, but of course, that's pure speculation. I have no idea.
Well, that's not impossible because two of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, died 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1826. The Declaration of Independence of the United States was July 4th, 1776. I mean, 1826. So it was 50 years later, and it was almost like they had decided to do that. That I think we have a bit of willpower to be able to decide when we're going to die.
And that's fascinating because if I remember correctly, Jefferson and Adams were actually rivals. I think they both ran for president in competition in the same year, but nevertheless, they remained great friends after that for the next 50 years or whatever.
Yes, yes, that's right. So these things require some kind of connection often, and you just described it. And
Absolutely.
Stephen would like, since he was so interested in these two men, would kind of and like to have the bookends of his life be marked by the birth and the death of each one of them. So we're only speculating. We don't have to speculate anymore, but it describes the potential for human beings to decide, at least within a time window, a time of death that might have a mark in history.
And I think the stress on emotion you raised, I think that's important because with Stephen, the emotional link, I suppose, was with Einstein and Galileo. And in the case of Jefferson and Adams, the link was between them. So I think you're right. Very often it's this emotional link which seems to be behind some of these synchronicities.
Absolutely. And to your precognitive potential about the prime minister, it's funny. It's so funny that you woke up by telling yourself a joke in the dream because you couldn't see yourself at the dinner table or the lunch table. You couldn't, so I can't see him because it's you. You have no mirror, and you could enjoy the joke in the middle of it enough to wake yourself up. It's
and
getting
that's never
to be
happened to me before. It's or since.
or since. I mean, that's a good one. And one of the ideas about precognition is that you don't know what's going to happen, but you precognitively read it in the newspaper.
Well, yes. And actually, Bernard, that leads, if I can now give you a third example related to newspapers, I would be very pleased to do so. I'm not going to blitz you with all these examples. This is the last one I'll give. I recall about 10 years ago, I had a dream, and in the dream, there was a cat. and the cat swallowed a ball. And the cat was very distressed and was trying to choke up the ball. And for some reason, this dream had a strong effect on me, and it woke me up. And I thought, why on earth would I dream of a cat swallowing it? It was a tennis ball. Why would I dream of a cat swallowing a tennis ball? Well, the next morning I went to work and I picked up what's called the Metro, which is the local London newspaper, which is produced every morning, and people tend to read it on the way to work when they're in the train. And I opened it up, and there was a picture of a catfish swallowing a ball. And well, I thought that's bizarre because it wasn't literally correct. You see, it wasn't actually a cat. It was a catfish, and it was a catfish with a ball in its mouth. But why I mention that is because it's an example of a precognition or a synchronicity which isn't completely accurate. But somehow it's the fact that it's not accurate, which is what's interesting about it, because the other thing is it's such an unusual image, the cat swallowing a ball. I mean, I've never dreamt of a cat swallowing a ball before or since. And it was that peculiarity of the image that woke me up, which led me to remember it. So I thought that was another example, interesting aspect of precognitions. They're often trivial in the sense that a cat swallowing a ball is nothing which is going to be epoch making. It's not going to change history. It's completely trivial. And yet that's what's so interesting, in my experience at least, that so many of these synchronicities are completely trivial. I mean, I'm talking about, I would say, I'm really talking about precognitions, but I mean, I think the same applies to probably more so synchronicities that they're trivial, but even precognitions, in my experience, are normally trivial. So I personally, I don't have great premonitions of bombs going off and the 9/11 Twin Towers or things like that. They're nearly always trivial incidents. And I don't know, you know much more about this than me, Bernard, whether that's a general characteristic that synchronicities are more often trivial than major.
It's all in the mind of the beholder, as you might guess. And for Stephen Hawking, that coincidence might not mean much because he's the hardline physicist. So it's so much about who is looking at it, but I can look at some from the outside. And there are some synchronicities people do all the time with numbers on the clock, but they interpret it sometimes as reinforcing that they're on the right path. So that people take these things for meaning. Now, the cat and the ball, I could imagine some people seeing that as a symbol of something that was more in their own subconscious. And Carl Jung would take that symbol with the cat and the ball, and then the fish and the catfish with the tennis with the ball, and ask the person to associate to it and to see what other images came out, with the idea that the subconscious and the unconscious is trying to speak to you, the dreamer, in some symbolic way. And this is just the hint.
That's fascinating. And I must confess, I'd not thought of this dream in this way, not try to psychoanalyze it in that way. But I mean, maybe you're right. In fact, I'm going to start thinking about that now, whether there is some symbolism of a cat swallowing a ball. I can't think of something off the cuff, but
well, he called it active imagination. And some people are more predisposed to do that even when they're not dreaming, or when they're awake. They just do it, or not in therapy. It's just the idea that the unconscious tries to speak to us, and are we going to listen to it or not? And you can over listen and you get crazy with it. You pick out the ones that are meaningful to you. The one with the prime minister, that's reading the newspaper, and that's a major event in England when he resigned.
Yes, that was a major event. Yeah.
And so there's a lot of emotion in that. And so you could pick up something in the air, we'll say. But the cat and the ball is so odd, especially with a catfish in the ball, that it becomes a low probability event. It seems like it's trivial, but because it's so specialized, it would get me to ask you to, no, we won't do that now, but to ask you to like, maybe there's a little bit more to it than what you're just saying. Maybe it's a little less than trivial.
Fascinating. I mean, in fact, would you say, Bernard, that synchronicities always involve some psychological significance, even if the experiencer doesn't appreciate it? Because sometimes
Uh,
I can't see what the meaning of the sometimes the synchronicity serves a purpose. Um, and sometimes it may even be inconvenient. You know, it can either be positive or negative synchronicities. But are you would you say that there's always some symbolic significance of a synchronicity?
no, I mean, we're both scientists and we know always is a problem. That you're not going to get that. And what you have to, as what we just did, think about is your own intuition using like the two great examples you have of Wilson resigning and you kind of picking that up. And that's a big thing, and that's it. You precognitively knew the Titanic was going down. It's almost something like that. On the other hand, the cat with the ball, that's an odd one. And for me, not necessarily you, the oddity of that, the low probabilityness of that, the kind of out of nowhere of that makes it one to at least take a look at.
Mm, that's most interesting. Um, but then there are other examples which aren't precognitions, but nevertheless are what synchronicities. I mean, maybe I could give a well,
Yes, yeah, go ahead and go ahead and make
if
it
it's
the
not out of
distinction.
place. I mean,
Yeah.
when my father died, my father lived to a good age. He lived to be 95, but he died in such circumstances. He was walking back from the shops. He'd had a knee operation, and he collapsed in the field. He took a shortcut to get to the house, and he collapsed in the field. I was away. I was in Canada, but he was living in England. And unfortunately, he must have fallen asleep, and it was the coldest day of the year. Uh, and he basically died of hypothermia.
Huh.
I mean, he probably thought someone would come along walking the dog and would help him up or something like that. We don't really know, but that never happened. And he was found the next morning, and he died of hypothermia in the field just 100 yards from his house. Um, and when I went back to England, um, uh, that was a few days later. I was in Canada, but I flew back to England. There were two things. First of all, the clock had stopped. Well, of course, that's a common feature of death. The clock stops. But what really struck me was he had a pile of books which he was reading, and the top of the book, on the top of the pile, was a book called The Outliers, which was a book by Malcolm Gladwell. And well, the topic of the book I won't go into, but it was the fact that it was entitled The Outlier. And my father had died because he was lying outside in the field. And of course, that's a rather, well, a very sad coincidence, but that's something which doesn't involve precognition. That's a pure, as far as I can see, a pure synchronicity. And I can't see what explains that in any causal mechanism. It just seems to be a pure coincidence, but it does involve death, which so often seems to be the emotion which is powering these things, and so I'll be interested how you react to that. It's a different type of synchronicity which just involves links between events, my father's death and the book that he was reading. And when I visited, by the way, Ed Kelly a few months later, we both know Ed Kelly at Charlottesville. I stayed with Ed and Emily at their house, and on his book pile, The Outliers was also lying on top. So, of course, if everybody was reading The Outliers, it wouldn't be such a striking coincidence. But nevertheless, that's just a sort of icing on the cake for that synchronicity.
One of the key lessons of synchronicities, like I'll say there are two of them. The clock stopping is the other one. And although you pass it off as kind of like happens regularly, I have not gotten enough examples of that happening regularly. I know it happens. I have several of them. There's an old song, "My grandfather's clock was too old for the shelf. It stood 90 years on the floor. And when the old man died, the clock stopped." And that's from the 1800s, exemplifying that idea and why clocks stop at the moment of death, particularly of someone who is very closely connected to that clock, is an important kind of coincidence. And there becomes a way of beginning to explain that. The outliers, I was just laughing because it's so clearly what happened. He was out lying 100 yards from the house, and there it was on the top. So what you have as we look at coincidences is both the personal meaning of the coincidence and the more explanatory about how the universe works or how reality operates. And here you have two beautiful examples with the clock and the outlier of a connection between a major human experience and of death and two external objects, mirroring the event of his death. This mirroring, and I ask you to comment on this, Bernard, because you look at anthropic principles, you look at mirrors of minds. The anthropic principle, as I understand it, is you see laws, let's say, of the universe that mirror the potential existence, a need for the existence for life on Earth. So there's this going from the small death to the large that we might do, but let's start with how the book and the clock are mirrors of a major emotional physical event and suggest our minds are much more connected with our environment.
I think that's very clear that the link between the minds and the environments is very strong, because ultimately I think everything is in mind. But let me get onto that a little bit later, and maybe I should say something about the anthropic coincidences, because you mentioned that. I should say, by the way, talking about clock stopping, in the case of my father, I couldn't be sure when my father actually died, the actual time, so I can't say for sure that the clock stopped at the time of death. But I was talking to somebody only a few weeks ago, and obviously this is anonymous, I won't say who, but this was someone whose husband had died, and he died at 4:27 in the morning, and the clock stopped at 4:27. So it wasn't just a vague, roughly a clock stopping at the same day, it stopped at the same time. And furthermore, in this case, the clock often would then stop again at 4:27 later on. And that's fascinating to me, because it might in some sense represent the psychokinetic ability of the wife, the widow who survived, in making the clock stop. So you can't say that it was the husband communicating. Maybe it was the husband communicating, but it might also have been the psychokinetic ability of the widow. But anyway, now let's get on to the anthropic coincidences, because you asked about those right at the beginning, Bernard, and I know I might be seeming to avoid it, but I'm very happy to get into that now, because, as you know, my professional area is cosmology, and these so-called anthropic fine-tunings are something which arise out of studies of cosmology and astronomy. So let me first of all explain what these coincidences are. In physics, we have various they're constants of physics, whose values are not explained, but must be taken as measured. So those constants might be the mass of various particles, fundamental particles. They might be the strength of the various forces, the so-called coupling constants, gravity, electromagnetism, the strong force, the weak force. But what is interesting is that it turns out that these constants have to have very fine-tuned values in order for there to be observers in the universe. Or more precisely, in order to form stars and galaxies and planets and chemistry and ultimately people, you need to have these fine tunings. And these aren't explained by current physics, because physics doesn't predict what these constants are, but it's just that if the constants were any different, or at least if they were different by even a small amount, we wouldn't be here. Now, this is called the anthropic principle. Anthropos is the Greek word for man, or human now, you better say, and so it was Brandon Carter who introduced this term, the anthropic principle, as saying that there is something about the universe which requires that we be here as observers, or at least we can only be here as observers if we have these relationships. Now, this goes back to the 1970s. I wrote a review on this with Martin Rees in 1979, which got published in Nature, which it got the subject some attention. But many physicists were very unhappy with this. They thought it was far too philosophical or even theological, because, of course, it sort of suggested in the minds of theologians that maybe God had created the universe and had chosen the coupling constants for our benefit. Now, obviously, physicists don't like invoking God. So at the time, it was a very controversial idea. And in fact, we got quite a lot of flack from people who said this wasn't really proper physics. Now the situation is very different. Now, some 45 years later, it's now relatively respectable. A lot of well-known physicists like Martin Rees and Steven Weinberg and Stephen Hawking and famous physicists, Leonard Susskind, now take this idea very seriously. And the reason people take the idea seriously is because there is the idea that you may have a multiverse. That's to say, there's not just one universe, but there are many universes in which the constants are all different. And the idea is you might have 1 million universes, most of them do not produce life, but just statistically, there will be some universes in which the constants are right for life. So by a sort of selection effect, we are going to be in one of the universes which has got the right values for the constants. So that's basically saying there is a selection effect. And that doesn't need God, it doesn't need consciousness, it just says there has to be lots of universes. Now, I have to say that a lot of physicists don't like that either, because these other universes can't be seen, so they would say, well, that's philosophy as well. But nevertheless, I've always claimed that these coincidences are there and they are significant. But what's interesting about this is it comes down to what is a coincidence? Because the arch skeptic will simply say, I don't believe any of this, it's just a coincidence. Okay, the final theory of physics is going to predict the constants uniquely, and if they happen to be the values required for life, that's just lucky. Okay, it's just a coincidence. And so the first debate when you have, because there are people who don't believe in the anthropic principle, they think these tunings are coincidence. So the first thing you have to decide is how many of these coincidences there are, and also how fine the tuning is. Well, there are actually something like a dozen coincidences, and the fine tuning it varies, but it might be 1% or something like that. I personally argue there is something to explain. These aren't coincidences which can be you can't just put this down to chance. There's a mystery to explain, and the multiverse is one way of explaining it. It's rather like winning the lottery. If you win the lottery, you might say, oh, that's a miracle. I've won. There's only 1 in a million chance of winning the lottery, so it's a miracle. But in fact, we know there's 1 million people who bought lottery tickets, so someone's got to win. But what's interesting about, I don't know that you would call the anthropic coincidences synchronicities, because you're giving them an explanation, which in some sense is causal. You're saying you need these coincidences in order for us to be here. So I'm not sure. I don't think I would call the anthropic tunings synchronicities, but it does raise the general problem, which often does arise, of what is a synchronicity and what is simply a coincidence, which does have an actual explanation. Because the point about the anthropic tunings is that we're trying to argue that they do have a natural explanation in terms of the multiverse. But in that case, of course, it's not a synchronicity. But I mention that because I think generally speaking, when you're dealing with coincidences, you often have a dilemma. Well, am I going to try and explain this in terms of physics, or is it just a synchronicity? Because, of course, some of the examples that we talked about before, the very personal examples, they're not to do with physics explaining something. That really is something which goes beyond the normal causality of physics. But there are a lot of things which might be called synchronicities, which actually probably will have an explanation within straightforward physics. So I hope that's clear, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. It's just what I think. A coincidence that's explained is no longer a coincidence.
Exactly. But then there's some coincidences which actually really are coincidences, which don't have an explanation either in terms of physics or in terms of any premonition or something like that. I'll give you a very simple example. I have a friend whose surname is Clark, Clark. It's quite a common name, Clark, but it had never occurred to me that the name Clark corresponds to the three elements. It's Cl, which is chlorine, it's Ar, which is argon, and it's K, which is potassium, and their atomic weights are 18, 19, and 20. So there's a coincidence that a common name corresponds to the three elements, but I wouldn't ascribe any psychic or synchronistic
meaning would be the term.
It means that it just seems to be a genuine coincidence, as far as I can see. Not coincidence, it just happens. So that's another example of something which I would be happy to say is a coincidence and without any further significance. You may disagree, but that's
I know that we have to say random is a way of explaining some coincidences. It can be overdone, saying it's all random. It can be the other end can be overdone about saying there's meaning in each one of these.
Oh.
And the random one allows one not to have to wonder about it and just pass it off. The other one, when you do too much of it, can make you a little nuts, because some people get psychotic or get caught up in trying to see what it means, both personally and about reality. So there has to be a narrow band about which ones you pick to
Indeed.
analyze for potential causation. And causation, there are two kinds of meanings in coincidences. One is personal and one is about the nature of reality. Those are the two basic meanings, and those become ways of explaining them. And we're caught up with cause versus explanation, and we can get into separating those out too. But I want to go back to the anthropic principle, because the multiple universe explanation uses randomness as the explanation for why we are fine-tuned in this place. It's, as you said, with if there's 1 million people with the lottery ticket, one of them is going to get it. It feels like a miracle to us living here that we can breathe and do our chlorophyll, which to me is another miracle. I mean, I don't know how chlorophyll happened, and there's ideas about it, but it's without the chlorophyll, we wouldn't be here either. So to me, it's kind of in the direction of the anthropic principle. But my question for you, Bernard, is, do you buy the multiverse, the multi-universe idea? Do you accept that as an explanation for the anthropic principle?
Well, I actually wrote or edited a book called Universe or Multiverse ? And the question mark was important because this included contributions from both, if you like, the believers and the disbelievers in the multiverse, because you have to realize it is a controversial idea. Even now it's controversial. So it's got a lot of very eminent advocates, But the fact is that some physicists don't like it at all, because the problem with the multiverse is that these are the universes you can't see. Okay, and therefore people say, well, if you can't see it, it's not part of the domain of science, because you can never confirm it. On the other hand, the counter argument is, yes, but it's predicted by theories which you may be able to test. So you have something called M theory, which is the final theory of physics some people like, and that predicts you've got the multiverse. Unfortunately, we can't test M theory yet either. Um, and so it depends really. Uh, if you ask me personally,
Yes, I'm asking you
I
personally.
personally take the view, I'm in favor of the multiverse. I don't mean I'm 100% convinced, obviously, but my current inclination is to say the multiverse exists because there are so many contexts in physics in which the multiverse arises. I mean, one makes it sound as though there's just one model of the multiverse. There are lots of different contexts in which the multiverse arises in terms of cosmological theory. You have what's called the inflationary model of the early universe, which produces lots of little bubbles. And you have cyclic models where the universe expands and recollapses and bounces and expands and recollapses. You have models from particle physics. You've got what's called the vacuum landscape, where you've got all these different models predicted by M theory with different values of what's called the cosmological constant. You've got the multiverse of the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. And you've also just got the idea that there may be different universes which are completely disconnected with even different mathematics. So there are many, many different types of multiverse. So when you start saying, do you believe in the multiverse? You have to say, well, which version of the multiverse are you talking about? I take the view that there are so many different versions of the multiverse that one of them is likely to be correct. I just think it's very arrogant to assume that our universe is the only one. I mean, the whole history of astronomy is one of arrogance, really. You know, we start off assuming the universe is the Earth, the geocentric view, and that was demolished. We realized that the sun was the center of the universe, and then you had the universe was the solar system, and that was the heliocentric view. But then people realized that the sun is just one of billions, 100 billion stars in the galaxy. So then people thought the universe was the galaxy. And that was the galactocentric view. And then people said, well, there are things outside the galaxy, other galaxies. And eventually, 100 years ago, that was confirmed. So now we believe there are hundreds of billions of galaxies, and we think the universe began with a Big Bang. And so that's what we call the cosmocentric view. But the point is, we can't see beyond what's called the cosmic horizon, which is the distance light has traveled since the Big Bang, which was 14 billion years ago. But that doesn't mean the universe comes to an end outside that horizon. It just means we can't see it. Okay, and no one would deny that the universe goes on beyond the horizon. Even the people who don't like the multiverse wouldn't disagree with that. And so I basically feel that there are so many models of the multiverse that my own belief is that there probably is a multiverse. However, the question is not whether the multiverse exists. The question is really, is it part of physics or is it philosophy? Because I'm happy to say that until we have the evidence for the multiverse, that it's sort of in this, I call it metacosmology. It's a sort of borderline between, if you like, physics and philosophy, but where you've got the suggestion of a model, but you don't have the data to confirm it. So, in fact, the whole history of cosmology is one in which your theory tends to go beyond the data, and then the data comes in and converts what is philosophy into physics. So, I tend to think of the multiverse like that. I think of it as part of metacosmology in the sense that it's a legitimate speculation, but it's not really 100% physics until we've actually got empirical evidence for it, for these other universes. And until then, you've got the indirect evidence that comes from fine tunings, because the fine tunings, I would say, are indirect evidence for the multiverse, but the multiverse isn't the unique explanation. There, you could have other explanations, like God, for example. So that's a bit of a detour, Bernard. But is that helpful?
Yeah, it is, because it illustrates the problem with confounding coincidences that are highly meaningful. it's highly meaningful that these constants make it possible for us to exist. And
Yeah, absolutely.
we have to be able to make meaning to make that meaningful. So we're here to make meaning out of it. And without the constants being fine-tuned the way they are, we wouldn't be able to even be talking about it. So it illustrates a major problem and conundrum. That's what's so great about the thinking about the anthropic principle is it raises the large question about how do we address meaningful coincidences when we don't really understand what makes them happen.
Yeah. So in fact, let me give you another explanation for the fine tunings, which is relating to that theme even more closely. This, if you like, is a third explanation. This explanation says that everything is described by a quantum wave function. And so a system doesn't even exist until someone has looked at it. Because so I toss a coin, for example, and it's a superposition of heads and tails. And until somebody looks, it's a superposition of heads and tails. It doesn't come into reality. It doesn't collapse to a particular state until somebody looks. Now, so the suggestion is, and this goes back really to John Wheeler, was that, well, maybe the universe doesn't properly exist until consciousness has arisen, because consciousness is actually what is required to collapse the wave function of the universe. So sometimes I draw a little picture, which is like a U, and at one end of the U, you got the Big Bang, and the other end of the U, you got the I, which is looking back at the Big Bang, like we're talking about the Big Bang now. And it sort of forms a closed circuit, and that, in some sense, brings the universe into existence. Now, this is all based on the assumption that it's consciousness which collapses the wave function, and that the universe itself has got a wave function. And so this is an explanation which says there is only one universe, but the universe itself is not in a well-determined state until somebody is there to look at it. And so that's the third explanation. It's not my favorite explanation. It's what you would call a philosophical explanation, because a lot of people, as soon as you talk about consciousness, many physicists will be turned off and say that's philosophical. But it is another explanation in which you're saying that in some sense, it's the existence of mind which is directly affecting the nature of physical reality. And I wanted to emphasize that explanation because although it's not my favorite one, I think it's linking up with a suggestion you made earlier in the conversation about the link between mind and reality. People, of course, say, well, that can't be right because we know the universe, humans only came into existence long after the Big Bang, where whatever it is, 400,000 years old or something. And we know from observations from telescopes, the universe existed well before then. And therefore, people say, therefore, it can't possibly be that our consciousness was collapsing the wave function. But when I use the word consciousness there, I'm not talking about human consciousness. I'm talking about, if you like, consciousness with a big C. That's just to anticipate a criticism you or others might have. Anyway, maybe that's enough about the anthropic principle, but whatever you think, Bernard.
Well, I'm in favor of that one. That because synchronicity keeps making it evident that our minds are embedded in our environment, and collapsing the wave function is getting very popular these days as observation makes something happen. There's lots of even personal things that suggest that being observed, just a person being observed, makes that person behave differently. And when that person knows that I'm being observed versus not being observed, there's something about observation and knowing you're being observed that creates something that's different than when you're just sitting there by yourself.
Well, that's true, but my view, Bernard, is that the whole point of bringing in consciousness and mind and observations, human interactions, is you're going beyond the current model of physics anyway, and so
Yeah, we're going.
That's one of
That's
my
what.
one of my main messages going to be. We hopefully we'll get onto this later in the conversation. Is that you need to extend your concept of physics to address the whole question of synchronicity, and of course that all relates to the question of the relationship between mind and matter.
Yes, and also relationship between mind and time. One of your favorite other ideas.
Oh.
Uh, so that when you, it's so funny for me to hear you say, "Well, the Big Bang happened a long time before human beings were conscious." And that, or some greater consciousness came, but just even the heliocentric kind of thinking that we tend to do about our own anthropic centrism that we have ourselves, that when you say, well, a Big Bang happened a long time ago, well, since you know that time is fluid and quantum mechanics is making that clear, what about the idea that being here now and being conscious now can somehow make that story of the Big Bang appear?
Well, that is very important, and let me address this, the whole question of time. And incidentally, this word anthropic means man in Greek. It's a terrible term because this is nothing to do with humans in particular. I mean, it's very arrogant to assume that humans are the only form of life and consciousness in the universe. So nevertheless, that's the word we're stuck with. Now, but let's get into the question of time, because as you say, that's one of my fascinations in physics, because as you know, in Newtonian theory, time is absolute. It flows at the same rate for everybody. When Einstein came along, he in special relativity in 1905, he introduced the idea that space and time emerged as part of four-dimensional space-time, and that radically changed the Newtonian view, because it meant there's no absolute time, there's no absolute present, and it means that time can flow differently. If you travel at high speed, the clock ticks more slowly. And then in general relativity, he found that gravity curves space-time, and clocks also change. They slow down in a gravitational field. So Einstein's theory of time is very different from Newton's theory of time, but it makes very precise predictions which can be measured. And Einstein's theory in both special relativity and general relativity works perfectly. But the point I want to make is that actually the one thing Einstein's theory doesn't explain is consciousness. It doesn't explain the passage of time, because in Einstein's theory of relativity, past, present, and future coexist. It's what we call the block universe. And the point is, there is no room in the block universe for consciousness. I mean, you in space time, you can imagine that your body or your brain follows a four-dimensional line. It's called a world line. Okay, so you're Bernard, you Bernard, not me Bernard, well, both of us, we're described by these lines in space-time, in four-dimensional space, called world lines. Now, we intuitively imagine that the passage of time, it corresponds, it's like a little bead which is going up the world line. So, so now it's 5 o'clock in England. Yes, an hour ago it was 6 o'clock. In an hour's time, it'll be 8 o'clock. And so that's our intuitive vision, that this bead is traveling up this wire, if you like, of the world line. And also I have the idea that I can make a decision. I'm going on a walk, I can go left or I can go right. I can make a decision. That's where free will appears to come into it. But the trouble is, neither of those processes is described by our relativity theory. There is no passage of time, because past, present, and future coexist. And there is no free will, because that implies you have a choice to go left or right. If the future world line is already there in the block universe, there is no free will. Now, that's standard relativity. And that's why many physicists will say the passage of time, which is what we mean by consciousness, consciousness
Ah,
is the passage of time,
wow, yeah.
most physicists say that's nothing to do with physics, because there's nothing in physics which tells you what is now. And so the general conclusion, which comes from philosophers, for example, is that the passage of time is just a reflection of mind. It's nothing to do with the physical world. Now, I take the view that we want to somehow expand physics to accommodate consciousness, because I think there's plenty of evidence that consciousness does interact with the physical world. I mean, obviously, it does it through the brain. If you believe in certain psychic phenomena like psychokinesis, I think there's also evidence that consciousness can interact with the physical world directly. And therefore, you need to have an expansion of physics which is going to accommodate consciousness. But the point I'm making is that relativity theory, which is our theory of the macroscopic domain, does not have the passage of time. So there is no consciousness in that picture. Now we come to quantum theory, which is the physics of the micro domain. Now you might say, well, consciousness does come into the quantum theory because maybe the consciousness collapses the wave function. So there is at least a hint in quantum theory that consciousness plays a role, that the observers play a role in the final theory of physics. But it's still not a theory, a full theory of mental experience. Nothing in quantum theory is going to explain my mental experience, or what if I have an out-of-body experience or anything like that, or even a normal mental experience. None of that's going to be explained by quantum theory. So the point I'm making is that you've got to go beyond relativity and quantum theory if you want to accommodate mind and consciousness. But that's no problem, because we already know, physicists know, that their final theory of physics has got to go beyond relativity and quantum theory. That's what they're all searching for. It may be M theory, it may be something else. But the point I'm making is that your final theory of physics is going to go beyond relativity and quantum theory. And it's at that level of that final theory that you're going to bring consciousness into the picture. And furthermore, that's if you're going to have any explanation of mental phenomena, be they normal, paranormal, or even mystical, it's at that level that you're going to have to find the explanation. Now, the reason I'm saying all this is because it all relates to the nature of time. Synchronicity, by definition, is always dealing with events at the same point in time. But then, what do we mean by time? Because we've already seen that the ordinary time of relativity theory, which is the time of the physical world, that doesn't describe mental experience. For that, you need another time. Because I haven't said, what is this higher theory of physics? This higher theory in physics, in my own approach, is in some sense, it's a higher dimensional picture. You have higher dimensions. Even in physics, you have the idea that there's higher dimensions. You've got the 4 dimensions of space and time, but also physicists have suggested that you've got extra dimensions which explain the other interactions. So I don't hope this doesn't get too technical, but 2 physicists called Kaluza and Klein said, well, maybe we can explain electromagnetism by introducing a 5th dimension, an extra spatial dimension, but it's wrapped up very small, so you don't see it. That was in the 1920s. But then later on, people sort of forgot about that. But in the 1980s, superstring theory came along and said, well, we need more extra dimensions in order to explain all the other interactions. And in superstring theory, there were 10 dimensions. So you have the 4 dimensions of space and time, but you get these 6 extra dimensions, which are all wrapped up. There were different versions of superstring theory, but then in the 1990s, we got what's called M theory, which I've referred to before. And in M theory, there are 11 dimensions. So there's the 4 macroscopic dimensions, and you've got 7 extra dimensions. So the idea of higher dimensions is quite common in physics. Now, there's one particular version of M theory which I really like, and this says that the material world is what we call a brane, BRNAE, which is a 4-dimensional slice in a 5-dimensional space called the bulk, BULK. So that, again, this is straight physics. I mean, not all physicists believe it, but at least it's coming from, brilliant physicists. But then the idea is that if there's this higher dimensional space, of which the material world is just one slice, what else exists in this higher dimensional space? And in my approach, this higher dimensional space is going to accommodate mind, because most mental experiences, whether they're normal, paranormal, or transpersonal, involve some form of space, but it's just not physical space. Now, I could go into a long detour about that, but I just want to say that the picture which I advocate says that this higher dimensional space, which is actually coming from physics, can itself accommodate mind. So the material world is a slice of this higher dimensional space, and you're putting mental things, if you like, in this higher dimensional space. So in my approach, our final theory of physics will be a higher dimensional theory which accommodates mind in this way. Now, then you can ask, well, what are these extra dimensions? And I will only say, this is probably already getting a bit too technical, I will only say that in my particular approach, these extra dimensions are actually, they correspond to different types of time. So you have a sort of hierarchy of times which are corresponding to a hierarchy of consciousness, or a hierarchy of self, if you like. Now, I hope that's not been too overwhelming, but the reason I've said all this is because when we talk about synchronicities, we're always normally talking, and we're talking about cause and effect, we're normally just talking in terms of the simple one dimension of time which comes out of relativity theory. If our final theory of mind is more complicated, that it has to be, I'm arguing. If there are higher times, I mean, let's just talk about one extra time to describe mental experience, then what you mean by a synchronicity is very different, because things in this higher time may be synchronous, even though they're not, they may be linked, even though they're not linked in from a common sense sort of four-dimensional point of view. So has that come across at all clearly, Bernard, or does it sound like gobbledygook?
Oh, it doesn't at all sound like gobbledygook. There's just questions of definition that have become unclear to me. And we're getting near the end, but I really want to know what you mean by dimension. And I'm going and just what does a dimension mean when we are talking about a dimension?
Because in physics, one has to be careful, because in physics, the word dimension is used in different senses. In quantum theory, for example, you talk about Hilbert spaces, which might even have infinite number of dimensions. But when I'm talking about dimensions, I'm talking about something more specific. I'm talking about, if you like, dimensions which in some sense are real physical dimensions. I mean, you've got the three dimensions of space, up and down, backwards and forwards, left and right. And that's what we would normally think of by real space, real dimensions. You might have thought that time was in some sense just a mathematical fantasy, but the whole point of Einstein's theory was that it said that time is a real fourth dimension, and so that space really is four-dimensional. And it's four-dimensional in the sense the only way to consistently reconcile how everybody experiences the universe is to say that there are these realities four-dimensional. And you might have thought that was the end of the story, but what we've learned from physics subsequently is it's not the end of the story, that actually our final theory of physics is going to have these higher dimensions. That's going to be the only way to reconcile all our experiences of the world. But I'm not now just talking about experiences of the physical material objects. I'm talking about our dreams and our out-of-body experiences, our mystical experiences. I'm claiming that all mental experiences are in this space. It's, if you like, I call it a universal structure. It's a higher dimensional reality, of which ordinary common sense reality, which is just three-dimensional, is just a slice. But the point about this is that this universal structure, this higher dimensional space, is essentially a mind. It's mind, but it's, if you like, a universal mind. It's mind with a capital M. what links all our minds. So our minds are not, in this picture, our minds aren't, consciousness isn't generated by the brain. We have our little consciousnesses which are filtered through the brain. So what this universal structure is this higher dimensional reality. It's basically a universal mind. And it's constructed in order to reconcile all our different experiences. But the point about it, the fact that it's mind is really crucial, because once you talk about mind, you have to talk about all sorts of other things. You have to talk about things like meaning. You have to talk about things like emotion. You have to talk about things like associations that arise in dreams. You have to think, you even have to think of humor. And I've often, sometimes when I have these experiences, synchronicities, I sometimes think this is crazy. It just must be God's sense of humor. He's just throwing in something just to show he's got a sense of humor. Because sometimes, as I say, these synchronicities don't seem to serve any purpose except to make you realize there's something fishy going on. So, but the point is, all these words like meaning and emotion and humor and love and association, these must all become features of this final theory. So when you start talking about synchronicity, you've got to bring all of this in. You're partly bringing in a more sophisticated view of time, but you're also bringing in all these other qualities which are associated with mind. And that's why I think this theory is going to be important in coming to finally have a model of synchronicity, because synchronicities aren't just a matter of having a consistent view of reality. You've got to bring in all these things like meaning and humor and emotions and association. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think this is wonderful. I deeply appreciate the mind that you are conveying to me, the expanded version of it. And that's without taking psychedelics or deep meditation. It's just tuning into your mind and seeing the mind that contains emotion and meaning and humor, and being able to imagine that mind, as I have often thought that we're just particles of that mind, that it's going through this. But, I really have to get going. But one of the things Federico said about this greater mind is that it's using us to get to know itself better.
I completely agree with that. I mean, as you know, I met Federico at a meeting just a month ago, and I really do believe in mind with a capital M, consciousness with a capital C, and it's fragmented into all these billions of little minds with little m's and little consciousnesses with little c, because that's how consciousness gets to know itself. That's how the universe gets to know itself. And that's why the universe is evolving, because as it evolves, we get to know ourselves. So I'm agreeing with Federico on that. I know.
How do you know this mind is using us to get to know itself?
Well, of course, I don't really know. That would be very arrogant. I mean, if I was a mystic, I could probably say, well, I've merged with the great mind, and
Well,
but
it's this desire to get to know itself, which started with the Greeks, know thyself.
well, I suppose, of course, I can't really say that. I'm only speculating, but it's just that I know even this little mind wants to get to know itself, and therefore I think in some sense the little minds are all a reflection of the big mind, and since the little mind is struggling to get to know itself,
Therefore, the
presumably so
big
is the
mind
big
is
mind.
trying to do the same thing.
Exactly.
Wonderful,
Yeah.
wonderful, 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 wonderful. Bernard, I didn't know what I would find picking up the rock that I had known you for in the social meetings. It's a different Bernard that I am now being introduced to, that I'm so appreciative of being able to know. So
Well,
thank
thank you, Bernard. You can't have too many Bernards, so the more we know, the better.
thank you very much for being with me today, and I'll let you know when we get this thing.
My pleasure. I'm sorry we've gone on a little bit too long, but hopefully you can compress time.
We're not going to do it. This part was too much fun. It's going to be there. It's going to be
Great.
there. Thank you very, very much, Bernard.
My pleasure. See you again soon in body or screen.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye for now, Bernard.
Bye bye, Bernard.
This is our mental atmosphere, like a hologram of cosmic consciousness.